about hostage negotiation, and I thought that was a little bit applicable for this morning, in the sense that it said all things are negotiable for hostage takers, and in essence what I wanted to take out of that is that it sounds like sometimes you feel as if, you know, females in this agency are a little bit like having been taken hostage, in the sense that they don't have the equal freedom as anyone else to be able to do what they want to do. And there's some really helpful tips in that presentation about how to, well, I'm a hostage negotiator by background, so part of my role is to manipulate circumstances in order to bring about, you know, a good outcome. I don't want you to be manipulative, but I certainly want you to think that you've got influence. And if you don't think you've got influence, please think again and speak to those people that have a good, nice, dominant voice within this sector, because I'm telling you the potential is very, very real. Very, very real. Anyway, hi. I'm Paul, and my role with the service is that I look after all the counselling and support functions for the Royal Fire Service. And so I have four main areas of my portfolio, and the one that you're probably most familiar with would be the Critical Incident Support Service, the Critical Incident Team. And so that's been around now for about 23 years, I think, that program, and it really is based at looking after, well, initially the traumatic incidents that firefighters or members may experience and therefore have some, you know, impact or dysfunction or concern in relation to, you know, the mental health involvement for traumatic incidents. So we've got that element. I've got the Employee Assistance Program, which is a fee-for-service based activity for paid staff and their immediate family. We have a Member Assistance Program, which is an information referral. So anybody in the state who's a member of the Royal Fire Service can contact my portfolio. It doesn't have to be related to the RFS. It might be something entirely personal or private, and we can't pay for your immediate care, but what we can do is to help identify maybe what the issues are and to look at what's available in the local community. So that's not a bad thing to have. And then we've got the other program. My last element to my portfolio is the Organisational Stress Management Program, and I guess if it doesn't fit neatly into the first three, it somehow gets involved there. But the sort of things we do there are more specialised activities for you know, major deployment and suicide intervention, depression awareness and that sort of stuff. And to some extent, what I'm going to share with you today comes out of that part of my portfolio. But I guess a bit about, as Rebel did, I'll sort of follow the same format, a bit about myself. I've just chalked up 15 years with the Royal Fire Service, which is just amazing, because I was actually only coming for 2 years. I've really loved the agency, and so I've stayed. But back in 2001, when my position was advertised, it was advertised for a period of up to 2 years. So it was a new position, and in my 5th year they made me permanent. They realised that they had me, and so they offered me to stay, and I've certainly stayed, and I've really enjoyed that. My background is a mental health crisis intervention specialist, and before coming to the Royal Fire Service I spent 12.5 years with the Salvation Army. The first 7.5 years was heading up their National Crisis Counselling Unit, and then the last 5 years was a senior management role, second in charge of all of their social and community service programs. But throughout all of that time I've been quite closely associated with emergency services. I've had the privilege of teaching in each of the other agencies. I still teach in fire and rescue and have done that for 22, 24 years or something in their critical incident program. The same with ambulance and chaplaincy and SES and the like. My role with the Royal Fire Service for the last couple of years has also seen me responsible for the critical incident response for Marine Rescue New South Wales. So 74,000 people wasn't enough, you know, for me to look after and their families, which takes it to about 300,000. Let's add another 3,500 with Marine Rescue. But it's been a really lovely fit in a sense, because they too are a voluntary agency and do tremendous work, not that dissimilar to what we're doing. So what do I want to do today? I want to be able to just have a bit of a conversation, let you know a few things, because in the last year or two there's been a really significant influence and change about mental health, not just within the emergency services sector that I'm going to talk about, but I'm sure you would agree with me that it's also about, you know, in society in general. There's a considerable influence filtering through in terms of making ourselves not just physically well, but mentally and emotionally and indeed spiritually well in that way. And so what I want to share with you this morning is some of the things that are happening in this field that directly relate to our agency and where there's other influences taking place. How are we matched in that, and how is it that we're actually being able to, you know, formulate improvement in this way throughout the Rural Fire Service for our members? So it says, let's improve our mental health and wellbeing by taking action. And I think that action, that notion of taking action is really, really important for a host of things. You would be familiar with the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but can't make it drink. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? But here's what I think about that sort of stuff. It's true. But what I want to be able to do is to try and educate the horses to first of all realise that there is water, and then to have some influence about coaching them along to the fact that they might need it, and if they have it, they will benefit from it, and they won't only survive, that they'll probably improve. So that's the mentality that I'm looking at. So, here's the thing. Is mental health serious in the Rural Fire Service? Yes, it is. Has it been around? Is it just a new thing? No, it's not. And so what's really interesting about that, you know, when they put my position on for the first time, full-time in 2001, you know, it was out of recognition that we needed, you know, more involvement in this area. The person who looked after my entire portfolio was allowed to do that. She was the welfare manager, or whatever they called it, health, safety, welfare, or safety, welfare, health, or something, I don't know what it was, something like that back then. And she was allowed 2 hours a week in her portfolio to be able to look at what really is my entire portfolio in that way. And so it's significantly different. Our critical incident program commenced in about 1993, and it was built on the back of what was the fire and rescue, or then the New South Wales Fire Brigades program. We've worked very closely together in that way. I just want to also talk about the fact that in that critical incident program, and I'm just absolutely tickled pink to be able to say this to you today, half the team are female. Pretty beautiful, don't you think? And let's talk about the bird poo. I found out that I thought there were 8 or 12 female group officers in the state. I've learned today there's 5. I've got 3 people on my team. 2 of them are group officers, and one's just finished recently as a deputy group, and I have 1 female inspector out of the half the team. Pretty good? Yeah. And in essence, we've had pretty much a nearly 50-50 split in terms of gender on that program since day one. And we always will do that. We've now actually tried to get in 2015 intake and in 2016 intake. We don't take an intake every year in that way. We've now got bringing on some more younger people in that way. And just a comment that I was listening to before, one of the people that we've brought on this year, female, relatively young, said to me, you know what, I have a reasonable firefighting background, but that's not why she's been brought onto the team. We've actually changed the dominant factors for that because of credibility, because the need has certainly changed. The Critical Incident Team program in '93 was there for operational traumatic incidents. But now what happens for us is that I have to make a provision in terms of the mental health and wellbeing through the peer support program for a host of matters which are not just operationally traumatic, but traumatic in other ways. Professional standards unit, investigations and inquiries, sexual misconduct, all sorts of mannerisms, misappropriation in terms of circumstances within the business function. And so I've needed to bring on board people that are going to be credible in more ways than just firefighting, because the service has considerably changed in that way. And so this person actually, when some of the, let's call them dinosaurs, and they may have been male or female, I don't know, I'm tipping that they're probably more male, said, you know what, how come you're on the critical incident? How did you get there? You know, what sort of experience have you got? And it really actually had a bit of a destabilising effect with this individual. My comment to her was this: here's the reason why you've been chosen, right? And what's really interesting, you want to take this back to them because they're knocking you about. You let them know that Paul Scott said, isn't it interesting that you're here and they're not? Okay, and there's probably some really interesting reasoning around that. Why am I making that statement? I want to be able to be of encouragement to you, to say, in essence, you know, I've got a small team considering the size. I can't openly put it to everybody to come on and do, like, you know, if anybody wants to do BF in the agency, that's fine. That's not the case for the critical incident program, right? Imagine if, for example, 10% of our agency wanted to join my team. Do you know how many people that would be? 7,000 odd people. Is that likely? Is that logical? Is it logistically able to occur? Absolutely not. So the people that actually do get through have really had to jump through some hoops, and we look at some fairly specific criteria in that. But isn't it great that there's that 50-50 split in terms of that gender activity? I think that's incredible. Incredible. Fabulous. Anyway, I'm waxing lyrical. So, let me tell you what's been happening of late. Back in September, October, November last year, a group of academics produced this under the chairmanship, I think it was Associate Professor Sam Harvey of the University of New South Wales and the Pathology Institute, looking at these expert guidelines. It's for the diagnosis, assessment and treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder within emergency services. Anybody heard of PTSD before? Yes. Anybody who hasn't? And you know what the sad thing about this is, that PTSD is absolutely devastating, right? But the sad thing is that when we think about the cohort, when we think about the amount of people that might be exposed to traumatic incidents, those that end up with post-traumatic stress diagnosis is just diddly squat. It's the smaller amount. So what are we doing about the rest? The difficulty is that PTSD over the last 10 to 15 years has received a lot of the research money, and it's in essence, you know, it's the highlight of what academia wants to focus on in that way. Well, we have to make a across the spectrum response in terms of looking at mental health and well-being of our people. Trauma is one element of that. What's interesting about these guidelines, and these are not so much for agencies like ours, we need to be mindful of them, but they were largely produced for the medical and mental health practitioners throughout the state, or indeed throughout the country, to ensure to say, you know what, when you get a PTSD diagnosis, and it's from an emergency services perspective, or law enforcement, or even indeed military, we need to think of it a little bit more differently. There are some specifics around that we want you to be very aware of, and to build that in to making sure that the diagnosis is accurate, that the assessment process is rigorous enough to accommodate the specificities of emergency service personnel, and that the treatment does that as well in that way. And there are some gold standards for traumatic incidents. And even though these were only produced at the end of last year, I'm happy to say for about the last decade or more, we've been operating with those gold standards anyway. So here's the thing in the Rural Fire Service. We've got a firefighter who's traumatised, right? It might be through cumulative effect, it might be a one-off incident, and their experience of that incident has shifted them from normal functioning mode, they're balanced, to something which is acute. They've not been able to cope because there's an overwhelming experience that they've had that they can't process and do well with. And it can be absolutely debilitating. So we've got our critical incident support program, we've got peer support officers, we've got clinicians that we can help with, and we involve them in that. And it might be that, my goodness, it's beyond the peer support level. So I have the ability to be able to make a referral or get a referral to look at the situation, and maybe then if the diagnosis and assessment comes back and says, you know, it's this and we only need 3 or 4 sessions, I have the ability to pay for that so we don't have to go down the workers' comp claim. But they might come back and say, look, this person now meets this criteria, and it might be that it's 14 or 15 or whatever many sessions. Then we'll say, okay, that's going to be longer term. Okay, let's go down the workers' comp matter. The thing that we're looking for there is that we have been operating with the information that these guidelines are basically now telling us, whereby the types of approaches that we will take will be cognitive behavioural therapy, or this other thing called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitisation reprocessing. See, I'm playing with your heads already. But what I'm saying to you is that, you know what, we're not just going down some crystal swinging, crystal gazing approaches to counselling that might be, you know, helpful or not helpful. We've been utilising what are now the expert guidelines for that sort of stuff for a while. And now we've got this rigour to ensure that those people that are treating our people, and the way in which the insurer, if it's a workers' comp matter, does, we now have this to refer to and to say that. So this was a really big thing. It was a launch in Parliament House that I represented the Rural Fire Service at, with the other senior people in other agencies. So I want you to understand that the stuff that the Rural Fire Service is trying to do within the mental health area for this agency has good backing and good rigour about what are either the gold standards or what are regarded as being good or healthy practice. Does that make sense? You with me? I haven't lost you? Right. And that's exactly what I just said to you. They're the sorts of things that we're looking for in that way. Well, that's the next slide. Okay, so then in March this year, Beyond Blue. Heard of Beyond Blue before? Yes. Yep. Fabulous organisation. Beyond Blue decided to hold a conference, a national conference, for the mental health of Australian first responders. And it was held in Sydney. Do you know what was interesting about this? Every single emergency service in Australia was represented. And I'll tell you what's even more fabulous. It was represented by senior executive people. Most agencies attending, I think the lowest rank that they sent was an assistant commissioner. Pretty big, eh? And so some sent their commissioners when they were available, or their chief officers. And so our agency was represented by Bronwyn Jones. Have you heard of Bronwyn Jones? Bronwyn Jones is the Executive Director for Membership and Strategic Services, and she sits at the Senior Assistant or Deputy Commissioner level within the Royal Fire Service. So she sits on the board. So there's Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons, we then have Deputy Commissioner Rob Rogers, we have Bronwyn Jones, who was just awarded the Public Service Medal in the honours list just recently. In that way, and we have a Senior Assistant Commissioner, Bruce McDonald. So we had Bronwyn Jones there, we had Assistant Commissioner Jason Heffernan, we had myself, and we had the Manager for Health, Safety and Welfare. So the Royal Fire Service had 4 representatives at this thing. What's interesting about this is that there was an overview that had been taken through some surveys that Beyond Blue had tried to do to look at what's happening with mental health, specifically in the emergency services sector. And there's some ideas that have been generated that have come out of that, and as a result of that, they've put this information out. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. I just want to focus on the fact, you heard of Jeff Kennett? He was the former Premier of Victoria. What an interesting man he is, right? And then there's the CEO, Georgie Harman, but then there's the Honourable Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia. both of these people were obviously at this event, and it was really interesting watching the comments that they had made. You may know, Kennett, Liberal, Gillard, Labor. Very opposing, very dominant individuals, and yet they've come together. Julia Gillard made the comment, she said, you know, a friend of hers had said when she had been approached to come onto the board of Beyond Blue, she said, you do realise who's running that thing? And she said, oh yeah, Jeff Kennett. She said, do you really want to put your head into that space? Interesting term, but nonetheless, you know, I'm sort of paraphrasing or taking a little bit of poetic licence, but nonetheless, the intent is real. And so here's the thing, and she said, you know, what's interesting is that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here. We can have diabolically opposing views about this, but when it comes to this, you know, I'm in agreement with Jeff and Jeff's in agreement with me about that. And she said, you know, that's the absolute thing we need for the Australian community to realise, to come together and all be singing from the one hymn sheet, irrespective of our different political views or any other type of difference that we might have. And that went over the audience really, really well in that way. And these were just some people that were there, but I'm just going to quickly go through that to this. Out of the survey that they've done, and they've gone and looked at all sorts of different programs that were running, they've come up under the Beyond Blue Heads Up initiative, good practice framework for mental health and wellbeing in first responder organisations. Now this document is aimed at not being too prescriptive, but to give a template, an overview, a good practice initiative in order for us to consider our programs and to look at mental health strategy now and into the future. And so there are a number of bodies that the Rural Fire Service sits on. I represent the Rural Fire Service in a number of ways. Let me just share with you how that's happening. So it's not a narrow focus that we've got. For about the last 8 years, in New South Wales, all the chief mental health officers and all the, you know, psycho mumbo jumbo coordinators and that, and all the senior chaplains have been meeting together twice a year in order to share information, to look at the dynamics of need and the dynamics of assessment and the dynamics of the provision of care in this realm. You know, we've sort of led the way in some respects. Some other states don't have that even now, and others do of more laterally. But what's been good about that is that we've got a really good understanding about, you know, what police do, what fire and rescue do, what the AMBOs do. So it's actually fire and rescue, rural fire service, state emergency service, police, ambulance service, St John's ambulance, VRA and marine rescue are represented, and the corrective services are there. And so we all get to share that information. And it's been really good, because we've been able to share initiatives and take certain things from each other's programs and tailor-make that in order to fit for what's relevant in each of those individuals. Now we've also got this. There has now been, we mentioned, I think Rebel mentioned AFAC, the Australasian Fire and Emergency Services Council, Authority, or whatever it is, Council. They now have a committee or a network that happens, and so all the people from all those jurisdictions, all those member jurisdictions come in, and we have a look at that. I now sit on that, and also more lately, the Ministry for Police and Emergency Services come together, because, you know, the focus largely was on the paid career personnel, and the voluntary agencies were, in essence, still not all that considered. That's now happening. With specific emphasis in relation to the emergency services voluntary agencies, and more lately, just in the last couple of weeks, the Department of Premier and Cabinet have called us all in together to make sure that we are operating in a collective environment. And what do we think about this? So there is a host of things that are happening at very senior levels that the Rural Fire Services is now a part of and considering. So what are we looking at this? We're actually looking at, yes, we've got really great reactive programs. You know what? If you need help, if you're an employee, we've got the EAP. We've got the critical incident program. If you've got trauma, we've got peer support. We've got information and referral for volunteers. We've got organisational stress management program. We've got everything covered in that sense. But what's missing? This is enabling us to establish what's missing. And what we need to be able to do is to up the ante in the preventative measures, up the ante in resistance building in that way, so that we become a more mentally healthy workplace. Make sense? Well, that's lovely. Keep hanging there. I've only got a couple of hours to go. And that's what it is. I've just quickly gone over that. But here's what we're sort of doing. We've been now taking a much broader view in terms of mental health. So for the Rural Fire Service, every single district team and zone manager throughout the state has gone through these sorts of programs. We have family days that the Rural Fire Service Association does, and we've gone, and you know what? A simple 10-minute presentation by myself and some of my peer support officer team, and we give out a bit of a brochure. We actually know that in the last 6 to 7 years, because they roll out about 4 or 5 of those a year, we actually know that we've identified 11 people that are still walking on the face of the planet that seriously wouldn't have been if it wasn't for that 10-minute spiel. We know that. And let me tell you, some of them were absolutely acute. One in particular, we had to bring intervention within the hour in order to secure firearms, because that was going to happen. There are 11, and that's what we know. There's probably a huge amount of others that we don't. And you know what? In the earlier days, it would have been, if it's not operational trauma, we don't deal with it. What Beyond Blue is suggesting, and fortunately what the Rural Fire Service has been doing for probably nearly 2 decades, is that we take a much more holistic view. We're actually interested in you. And some things we cannot pay for if it's your issue, but by Jove, we will do what we can to support you. So we've got my beautiful portfolio, and we've actually got the chaplaincy and family support elements as well. And there are senior chaplains, Ian and Kerry Small, and you were probably more familiar with Ron and Carol Anderson before that, who were there. I saw last night, they were invited to a function that I was emceeing last night for the fire service. So what's interesting about that is that those 2 programs have the ability to generate a response where required of a caring and supportive nature when needed. What we've now gone on to is to try and help ourselves really understand this notion about what is mental illness. And so I'm thinking that time probably won't permit for me to do that, but I want to let you know, in essence, the flavour of what we're doing. So what is a mental illness? What are the types of mental illnesses? Who do they affect? Is mental illness a lifelong condition? And is mental illness a disability? And then we go through some facts about that. People with mental illness can and do work. Do you believe that?
Yes.
Yeah. See, what's really interesting about this, we've looked at the Beyond Blue framework, and we're now drafting a strategy which says this. What are the key features that we need to do in the Rural Fire Service? And it's this. Let's increase the literacy of mental health, right? Let's be out there talking about it in ways far more than we've ever done before. Let's be warm and real with it, okay? Let's make it as if it's second nature to us. You know, the I'm safe principle helps us get and do on the trucks and in this agency because we need to be physically fit. Well, now we're saying we need to be emotionally and psychologically fit at the same time. There is no difference. Let's be holistic about it. So there's that element. Let's increase the mental health literacy. The second thing, let's reduce the stigma associated with this thing called mental health condition, mental health illness. Right? Having then reduced the stigma, let's now build more capacity. So what are the options available to us to either get information or to understand what's available to us in terms of getting assessment or treatment that's required? Simple things. It might not need a clinician. It might be something that we can do ourselves. So what are those coping mechanisms that we're able to adopt that will be beneficial to strengthen us and to bring a robust response to us? That's the third. And the fourth area is about accessibility. So how do we actually increase that ability for people to link in to other ways to actually get really good, healthy treatment in that way? Because the thing is that statistically, did you know 1 in 5 in Australia are likely to exhibit or experience a mental health condition within their lifetime? Well, let's just look at the room, right? I don't know how many people we've got here, 40, 50 people, okay? So if there's 50 people in the room, hello, we've got 10 of us at some point. This is real. And the thing is, as we go through these sorts of things, we're trying to, in essence, increase the ability and encourage people to actually take action and to improve. Is mental illness treatable? You bet it is. My goodness, if we even think of the pharmacological responses that take place now for things like depression, we've made so much advance in this way. And yet there's still a stigma that says, oh gosh, you're taking a pill for depression, you're mental. Well, actually, you've got a mental health condition, but you're not mental in the detrimental or derogative term. Interestingly enough, the antidepressant medication largely is about trying to help stabilise, reduce anxiety. It can be used for. But when we think about the biochemistry of the brain, did you know that people that suffer depression for a long period of time, they actually have a depletion of things like dopamine, serotonin and noradrenaline? And part of the medication is about replacing that. Because when those things happen in the biochemistry of the brain, guess what happens to the person? Did you know that they can't generate positive thought? And if you can't generate positive thought, what are you left with? The negative crap. And the more negative crap, the more spiralling that happens. You're in deep doo-doo. It's hard to get out. So you might need some help. And not only is the help pharmacological, but if you add some psychotherapy to that to actually help ventilate, get off, understand, and then equip yourself to do things that are better in bringing about your way of living, so be it. So are these things treatable? Yes, they are. Even post-traumatic stress disorder is treatable. Yes, there will always be some that maybe may not recover. But that should not prevent us or stop us or hinder us or preclude us from taking the option of trying to get well. The vast majority of people with mental illness are not dangerous. True. Some are, very small amount, but the majority of people are not dangerous, okay? Are not dangerous. People with mental illness live and work in our communities. Hello? Yes. People with mental illness have the same intellectual capacity as anybody else. What do you think? Uh-huh. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. In actual fact, the majority of those things, when we think about mental health illness, if we look at the sort of the big 3 areas, of that, we've sort of got, depression and anxiety and those things, mood disorders and that sort of stuff. We've got sort of the next ones which, might include the bipolar disorders, a little bit more dysfunctional, and then we've got the psychotic disorders. What we mean by psychotic disorders is that the person has suffered a break from reality. Does that make sense? And they actually require greater involvement, probably more medication in that sense, certainly much more rigorous treatment in that way. But it's not, the majority by far are not about lowering of intellectual capacity or any impairment that way. That's not to say that they might be a bit slower, may be a bit more confused, for a period of time until stability happens. But their intellectual capacity is not, interfered with. People with schizophrenia do not have multiple personalities. Is that true or not?
True. Yeah, they don't.
They don't. Who said that?
I don't believe they do.
Well, you're right. So give yourself a
There's
pat.
multiple personality and there's schizophrenia, and they're
You're
two different things.
You're a beautiful lady. You are a beautiful
things.
lady. That is absolutely right. And yet, isn't it interesting throughout the media, in films and things, they make out that it is. It's not like that at all. In actual fact, people with schizophrenia considerably are able to live very healthy, functioning, integrated lives. And yet we think schizophrenia, you're a nutcase, you know, mental zombie, whatever. It's not true. How do I talk about mental illness with my worker? So we've got information about that for our people. What do I do if a worker is displaying symptoms of mental health illness, but they haven't told me about it, so we have discussions about that. You know, what are my responsibilities when a worker's not disclosed their mental illness? Does a worker have to disclose their mental illness?
No. Depends on the occupation area.
Depends on the occupation, it depends on what they're doing, but the legislation actually says no unless it has the absolute capacity to interfere or reduce. Absolutely right. But in our area of work, no. Isn't that interesting? What is my role if a worker's mental illness impacts on others? So we've got information available for our people around this. What can I say to other work colleagues about a worker with mental illness? And then these sorts of things about how do we adjust. So we talk about what are reasonable adjustments, because these times now, particularly with workers' comp matters, it's about integrating or reintegrating the person back into the workplace. And they're saying the sooner that you're able to do that, the more likely, there's some research evidence that suggests you're more likely to get a much better outcome established for that individual. How do I identify and make these reasonable adjustments? These are all information that we've got for our leaders, okay, in that way. And what we're doing is we've been rolling it out to the staff, and it's our hope that within the 5-year plan that these sorts of things are available for volunteers, so for brigades as well. We're looking at building the intranet page for our stuff to actually have linkages with the places like Black Dog Institute and Beyond Blue. And here's some of the things, I've got handouts for you that include some of these things. Managing someone with a mental health condition. So isn't that great information, either at the brigade level or at the chief super level? You know, it doesn't matter. Supporting someone at the workplace who's at risk of suicide, and then there's all this information here from the Counselling and Support Network information, and this is a lovely thing on the back. Are you or one of your mates? If so, it could be depression. With the right treatment, most people recover. Your local GP is a good person. In the last probably 8 to 10 years, the medical fraternity and the federal government have put together this ability that you can go to the GP and under an assessment get a mental health care plan done, which will enable also the establishment of a referral to a mental health clinician that can be largely funded under the Medicare regime. You can get up to 6 sessions, and I think with an additional 4 sessions after that. So here's the thing about that. I mean, there are some connotations for some people, like the ambulance, where's my ambo, mate? Like the ambulance person was talking about the fact that, you know, some people in the health setting and others, you know, have to make a notification, and it could be problematic. Check it out first, but I want to say this. This has been one of the best initiatives in terms of doing 2 things. Reducing the stigma and making it more accessible to get great assessment, diagnosis and treatment under that. And what the statistics are indicating, that if it's the earlier that this can happen, the greater the likelihood of recovery. And with those 6 and 4 sessions, there is sufficient information, sufficient treatment option, and if it's linked up, if necessary, with pharmacological medication, that these 2 things in themselves, as a mix, bring about the difference, and a person can recover and function. That's what we're aiming for. Particularly when you think, gosh, the statistic of 1 in 5 could even be more than that to some extent. But that's a lot of people, and this is a great way of being able to establish a good approach. And this screen, this is really interesting. You can see it, can't you?
Yeah.
Because you know what? Sadly, this is what I think it's like for a lot of people. When they are struggling and then they're thinking about the stigma and they're thinking about how other people are going to view me. So what I'm trying to say is this. I think the RFSA wrote me up one day. I don't see mental health condition any different than a physical one. I noticed that our colleague here's got a bung arm with a couple of things happening, right? Well, that's great. Isn't it interesting that we can see that and we know to actually treat her a little more caringly in the way in which we approach and things like that. I don't see that any different than somebody who's suffering with depression and needs that consideration to be flexible, to be adjusted with in a positive framework that will enable that person to eventually recover and have not just the sling gone, but the black dog gone too. Does that make sense? And can you imagine what it's like for somebody whose life's like that? Then what do they need? They need you and I. They need you and I to help shine some light. And if you're not sure how to do that, one of the things that we're embarking on is helping you identify and find out what can you say, what can you do, in essence, what can you believe in order to bring that about. Does that make sense? So I'm thinking that I'm happy to take questions. Is that good? Yeah.
Paul,
Hi.